Some wedding nights begin with roses. Roman queens began theirs beneath iron, under the watch of priests, relics, and a god carved indecently from stone. Before they could touch their husbands, they were made to ride the god of shame and pretend it was holy. Imagine that, a young bride, trembling before an altar, told that humiliation was purity, that modesty must be sacrificed to make her worthy of being owned. Rome called it a blessing. The gods called it obedience. Tonight, we're walking into those chambers, the ones history tried to lock shut, where politics shared a bed with fear, and the empire's power was sealed in candlelight and silence. So, before we begin, tell me, what time is it where you are tonight? And while you're still awake, subscribe if you love what I do, or you just might never find this channel again. Now, draw the curtains of gold and fire, and let's see what waited behind these queens. You'd think a Roman wedding night would begin with wine, music, maybe some tragic poetry and expensive perfume. It didn't. It began with a god, and not the sort that comforts. Before the bride was even allowed near her husband, she had to pay her respects to Mutunus Tutunus, Rome's patron of fertility and, let's say, uncomfortably realistic sculpture. He wasn't the charming marble ideal of Apollo or Mars. He was different, carved not to be admired, but endured. Picture this. A small torchlit temple tucked between alleys, smelling faintly of incense and something less holy. The marble floor cold under bare feet, the air heavy, almost embarrassed by itself. The girl, 14, maybe 15, led forward by her attendants, her orange veil trembling in the light. And there, at the center, stands the god. A statue of a man with nothing but his purpose on full display. He's ancient, older than the Republic, older than the Latin tongue that dares describe him. His name, Mutunus Tutunus, was whispered, half in reverence, half in discomfort. Because everyone in Rome knew what came next. The bride, this future matron of noble blood, this carefully chosen vessel of alliance and inheritance, was told to sit upon the idol, just briefly, as part of a ritual that would take away her modesty, to remove shame before entering her husband's house. Now, historians, bless them, love to debate this. Augustine wrote about it with disgust centuries later, after Rome had found Jesus and decided everyone before him was mad. He called it obscene, barbaric, proof that pagans were hopelessly depraved. And maybe he exaggerated, or maybe he didn't, because the Romans, for all their grandeur, had a spectacular ability to turn discomfort into devotion. To them, the act wasn't filthy. It was sacred. It was practical theology. You could pray to a fertility god, yes, but it was better to demonstrate your sincerity. And what better proof than a gesture that made the gods blush? The priest, usually an older man who had seen far too much marble, would chant verses about purity, virtue, the duties of a Roman wife. "Sit, my child," he might say, "so that shame may leave you." And she would. No one laughed. No one dared. The torches flickered against the polished stone, turning the carved god into something alive, or at least something that watched. The bride trembled. Maybe she prayed. Maybe she thought of her mother, who likely endured the same thing years before. Maybe she just stared at the floor, trying not to think about the absurdity of becoming a wife by doing something no poet would ever describe in verse. Some accounts say it was brief, a symbolic touch, nothing more. Others claim she had to sit long enough for the chant to end. Historians can't agree. And honestly, who would take notes at a moment like that? What we do know is that this ritual wasn't a joke. It was performed by the most respectable families, the kind whose names carved themselves into history, the Claudii, the Julii, the Cornelii. So yes, even women like Scribonia, who would go on to marry the future Emperor Augustus, likely endured this small act of divine embarrassment. She was no peasant girl, no naive villager. She was a patrician, educated, well-bred, fluent in Greek philosophy, and yet still expected to sit on a god shaped like a scandal. Because in Rome, decency and indecency were sometimes the same thing, depending on who was watching. And that's what makes this ritual so revealing. It wasn't about fertility. Not really. It was about obedience. The bride's first act as a Roman wife was to obey something she didn't understand, in front of people she didn't trust, for reasons no one dared to question. It was the perfect rehearsal for marriage. Now let's step a little closer. You can almost hear the sound of the fabric rustling, the low murmur of attendants reciting memorized prayers. The temple smells of resin and sweat. On the wall, a painted inscription, long since lost, likely read something like Pudicitia relicta, modesty laid aside. Even the gods, it seemed, wanted witnesses. For a moment, time slows. You stand there, watching her. The torchlight catches on her veil, that flame-colored cloth that marks her as a bride. Her hands tremble, clutching the hem. She hesitates. One attendant gives a reassuring nod, as though this were as ordinary as a handshake. And then, she sits. It's not the act itself that's haunting. It's the silence after. That moment when no one knows whether to look away or pretend nothing happened. And yet, the ritual continues as if nothing strange occurred. The priest sprinkles perfumed oil, mutters something about Venus's blessing, and sends her home, a little less herself, a little more Roman. They'll tell her it's tradition. They'll say her mother did the same, her grandmother too, that this is how civilization preserves itself, through humiliation disguised as holiness. And that is where the genius of Rome lies, the ability to wrap power in ritual, cruelty in ceremony, and call it civilization. Because this wasn't just about one girl and one god. It was about reminding every woman that her body wasn't her own. It belonged to the gods, then her father, then her husband, and, if she was unlucky, the historians who would later use it as a metaphor. You might wonder if she believed in the God watching her. Perhaps she didn't. Perhaps she believed in survival. Perhaps she knew that faith was less dangerous than defiance. After all, the gods of Rome didn't forgive rebellion, and neither did husbands. When she left the temple that night, her face probably looked calm. The Romans were excellent at composure, a whole empire built on the art of pretending not to flinch. But somewhere behind her eyes, a seed of unease took root. That uneasy awareness that her life would now be watched by men, by gods, by history itself. And that's the true horror of it. Not the statue, not the ritual, not even the priests with their oily smiles. It's the understanding that in Rome, shame was not to be avoided. It was to be performed. Because a wife who could endure humiliation was a wife who could endure anything. And endurance, to the Romans, was the highest virtue. So yes, even before her husband saw her, the gods already had. And Rome applauded. When she crossed her threshold later that evening, no one spoke of the temple. The torches had burned down. The city hummed with distant laughter. But the ritual stayed with her, a memory carved into silence, like the god himself. Years later, when her daughters married, she'd tell them it wasn't so bad. that it was tradition, that it meant the gods would bless their homes, and the cycle would continue, each generation sitting upon the same cold stone of superstition, mistaking submission for sanctity. Rome didn't test purity that night. It tested obedience, and in that test, every bride, from nameless girls to noble queens, was expected to pass. The Romans had a gift for making a spectacle out of anything. War, funerals, childbirth, even plumbing repairs. Everything became an event. So it shouldn't surprise you that they managed to turn a wedding night into a public comedy show. The evening before the ceremony, the streets glowed orange with torchlight. Laurel and ivy hung from balconies. Musicians tuned their flutes, and neighbors poured into the streets. Everyone smelled faintly of wine, smoke, and self-importance. Somewhere in that crowd stood you, the bride, draped in a flame-colored veil, the focus of an entire city's entertainment. This was your night of honor, and the Romans chose to celebrate it by making fun of you. They called it Fescennine verses, crude, improvised wedding chants. To the Romans, obscenity wasn't vulgarity, it was protection, a way to scare off evil spirits. The gods, apparently, disliked sincerity, so laughter, the dirtier, the better, was believed to keep misfortune away. You'd been told there would be music, but no one warned you the lyrics would rhyme hymen with words best left untranslated. In front of your father's house, a small crowd gathered, senators, soldiers, half-drunk poets, and one neighbor who always found an excuse to attend parties that weren't his. The flutes began to play, and a chorus of cheerful voices shouted the name of the marriage god. Hymen, O Hymenae. At first it was sweet, a prayer for the god of weddings to bless your union, but Romans were incapable of leaving anything unspoiled. The next verse came out slurred with wine. May her husband find her pure, and may she not pretend too sure. The crowd erupted in laughter. Someone clapped you on the back. Someone else shouted, "That's a good one," and passed another cup of wine. Your mother smiled weakly. Your uncle laughed a little too hard. Then came another voice, louder, bolder, less poetic. Let her blush, let her cry, but soon enough she'll know why. The crowd howled. Even the musicians couldn't keep a straight face. You tried to smile because everyone else was smiling, and because standing still was the only power you had left. It was supposed to be joyful. It felt like a roast. The Romans, however, saw no cruelty in this. They believed purity attracted envy, and envy attracted demons. So if a bride was mocked loudly enough, the gods would assume she wasn't worth cursing. In other words, humiliation was just another form of protection. It was civic duty disguised as entertainment, and it was always performed in public. Even the most respectable women of Rome, the Julias, the Claudias, the Octavias, were not exempt. Octavia Minor herself, when she married Mark Antony, likely endured the same ordeal. Senators, priests, and poets shouting rhymes about her body as though it were a public monument. Rome had an extraordinary ability to take things sacred and make them slightly ridiculous, and the people applauded themselves for it. Somewhere behind the laughter, an older woman, perhaps your aunt, shouted, "Don't be shy, my dear. It's all part of the blessing." She meant it. In her world, modesty was expected, but too much modesty could offend the gods. A bride was supposed to be innocent, but not naive, obedient, but not speechless. The Fescennine verses were meant to loosen the tension, to make the ceremony more natural. Of course, natural in Rome was always a matter of perspective. The chants grew louder, rolling through the streets like a storm of mockery. Each rhyme ended with a cheer, each cheer with another toast. The torches burned lower, the jokes got bolder, and through it all, the god's name, Hymen, Hymenae, kept echoing, a reminder that divinity and indecency were often the same thing. Hymen, the supposed guardian of virginity, must have been the most overworked god in history. The Romans shouted his name so often it lost all holiness, like a punchline repeated too many times. If you were lucky, the jokes stayed poetic. If not, they became graphic. The crowd sang about what your husband would discover, what the bed would reveal, and how the gods would rejoice. It was all considered affectionate. This was how Rome expressed its blessings, with rhythm, rhyme, and ruthless curiosity about your private life. And you, veiled and motionless, learned your first Roman lesson. Silence can be both shield and submission. The Romans didn't separate reverence from ridicule. They believed that the universe itself thrived on contradiction. Purity had to be mocked to stay pure. Virtue had to be embarrassed to remain virtuous. It was a logic that worked perfectly for everyone except the person standing in the middle of it. From where you stood, the laughter felt endless. The city blurred into torchlight and faces, wine and words. Somewhere among them was your husband, smiling, proud, and already half drunk, oblivious to the fact that his new bride was trying not to disappear. Eventually, the songs died down. The flutes grew quiet. Someone declared the omens favorable. The guests applauded, thinking they'd done their part to bless your future, and you were left standing in the same spot, grateful it was over, ashamed that it had ever begun. The street emptied slowly. The garlands wilted. The laughter lingered, bouncing off the walls long after the voices were gone. For the rest of your life, you'd hear that sound again, the roar of Roman humor, bright and brutal, echoing in your memory whenever someone laughed too loudly. Centuries later, scholars would call the Fescennine verses a vibrant expression of Roman vitality. They'd call them earthy and light-hearted, charming euphemisms for cruelty. But standing there, wrapped in the scent of smoke and sweat, it didn't feel lively or poetic. It felt like standing naked in public, wearing only good manners. Rome always found a way to disguise domination as entertainment. They'd tell you it was tradition. They'd say everyone endured it. They'd assure you that laughter built character, that you should be grateful to be laughed at. And in time, you'd learn to pretend it didn't bother you. You'd join in the laughter, because in Rome, that's how survival sounded. Years later, when your own daughter married, you'd tell her the same thing your aunt once told you. Don't blush. It's for your own good. You'd smile as the chants began again. You'd call it harmless. Because pretending it was harmless was easier than admitting what it truly was. The Romans thought laughter kept away evil. But maybe, deep down, they knew the truth, that laughter was the evil. In a world that worshipped control, laughter was just another weapon. And that night, you learned what every Roman bride eventually learned, that even joy came with an audience. And sometimes, the sound of laughter could echo like cruelty wrapped in music. If you're still here, listening to her story when most would have scrolled past, then you're one of the few who actually hear the women history mocked into silence. Subscribe, or let their voices fade the same way Rome wanted them to. The Romans called it domum deductio, the leading home. But that was just the polite version. To most brides, it felt less like leading and more like being taken. It was the final act of the wedding, the moment the bride left her father's house for her husband's, a parade, a ritual, a performance. Every marriage in Rome, from peasant cottages to palaces, included it. And like all Roman traditions, it had a flair for the dramatic. You can almost see it. The narrow streets lit by torchlight, shadows trembling against brick and marble. The bride, you, wrapped in a veil the color of fire. It wasn't white, because white was for funerals. The Romans preferred orange-red, flammeum, the color of hearth and sacrifice. The symbolism wasn't subtle. Around you a crowd has gathered. Neighbors, relatives, musicians, slaves, a few curious strangers pretending to know you. Your husband waits ahead, expression carefully arranged into that Roman blend of pride and boredom. Behind you, your mother hides her face. She's crying quietly, not because she's sentimental, but because that's part of the ritual too. Everyone is expected to weep. If no one cries, it's bad luck. The gods apparently prefer a little misery with their matrimony. The priest gives the signal, the flutes begin, and the procession starts moving. Someone shouts, "Talasio," an ancient cry that once meant "for Talasius." The story behind it is almost comical. Legend says that during Rome's founding, when the men realized their new city had no women, they invited their neighbors, the Sabines, to a festival. Then they kidnapped all the Sabine women. When the men of the city demanded to know where one of the abducted brides had gone, a Roman shouted, "For Talasius," naming a nobleman who'd claimed her. The phrase stuck. For centuries afterward, it was shouted at every wedding. Rome loved to memorialize its crimes and tradition. So when the crowd yells "Talasio" tonight, they aren't wishing you happiness. They're reenacting the empire's favorite story, abduction disguised as destiny. You're expected to cry a little as you're led away. It's symbolic resistance, the same performance every bride gives. You're supposed to act as though you don't want to leave, as though this departure is unbearable. Because in Roman logic, a good wife begins her marriage by pretending she doesn't want one. If you resist too much, you're ungrateful. If you don't resist at all, you're shameless. So you cry just enough to make everyone comfortable. The attendants take your hand. The torches close in around you, their flames swaying in the evening air. The musicians switch to a quicker rhythm, and the laughter begins. That forced communal laughter Romans used whenever something deeply uncomfortable was happening. You're walking now. Every step feels rehearsed. The road to your husband's house is short, but the ritual makes it feel endless. The heat of the torches catches on your veil. The smell of smoke fills your lungs. Children run beside you shouting verses they don't understand, and behind them, the older men watch in silence. Because every Roman man, at some point, has stood where your husband stands tonight, waiting to receive what law and ritual have already claimed as his. They call this moment the transition to a new household. What it really is transfer of ownership. When you cross your husband's threshold, you will pass from the manus, the hand of your father, into that of your husband. Everything you own, even your name, will be absorbed into his family. You're not leaving home, you're changing owners. But Rome is kind enough to dress it up as theater. The crowd keeps chanting, "Talasio, Talasio," while the torches light your path. You can almost hear the gods chuckling above. They've seen this scene 1,000 times. They never tire of the irony. Your attendants whisper advice in your ear, how to speak, how to walk, how to kneel when you reach the door. You nod, trying to remember each detail. The firelight blurs the world into red and gold, You've rehearsed this for weeks, but in the moment, everything feels foreign. Your body, your name, even your breath. Then, as the house looms ahead, someone throws a torch into the air and catches it again. The crowd cheers. The symbolism is obvious. You're bringing the fire of your father's hearth to your husband's. The Romans loved this kind of poetry, gentle metaphors for brutal transitions. You reach the doorway. The music fades. Two men step forward to lift you over the threshold because tradition forbids your feet from touching it. If you tripped, it would be a bad omen. And besides, it's better if you appear unwilling. The illusion of resistance must be maintained to the very end. Inside, more torches flicker. A small statue of the household god watches silently from its niche. The women inside clap and cheer, as if you've conquered something, though no one seems sure what. You're placed gently on the floor. Someone presses a loaf of bread into your hand, a symbol of domestic duty. Another ties a woolen band around your waist, marking you as wife, housekeeper, and property in one efficient gesture. Outside, the crowd still calls your name. The air hums with celebration, but none of it feels real. Your husband steps forward and offers his hand. His voice is calm, rehearsed, the voice of a man who knows the lines he's supposed to deliver. "Welcome home," he says, as though you chose it. But you didn't. You were chosen by your father, by the priests, by the empire itself. Because marriage in Rome wasn't private, it was policy. When Octavia Minor married Mark Antony, the city lined the streets just like this. The Senate called it a union for peace. Rome's greatest generals smiled for the crowd, shaking hands as though love itself could repair civil war. And there she was, standing between them, the gift that sealed their agreement. They called it union. She knew it was surrender. History remembers that wedding as the night Rome pretended to reconcile. The torches burned bright, the people cheered, and Octavia, educated, noble, painfully young, walked silently beside the man who would soon humiliate her for the world to see. She played her part perfectly. She cried when expected, smiled when required, and let the empire carve her life into a political gesture. That's what the Domum Deductio really was. A choreography of control. A symbolic kidnapping disguised as ceremony, carried out under the approving gaze of gods and neighbors alike. The Romans loved to say that marriage united families. In truth, it united ambitions. Every bride was an offering to alliances, to reputation, to Rome itself. You look back once, just before the doors close. The torches outside flicker in the night, their flames bright against the dark. You can't see your mother anymore. The street smells of smoke and tears. For a moment, the chant of Talasio echoes again, faint but persistent, like the ghost of a joke no one dares to explain. And then the doors shut. The music stops. You are home. They will tell you that the fire you carried symbolizes warmth and protection, that your tears were the price of love, that the chanting was joy. They'll tell you this is what every Roman woman wants, but you know better. You felt the weight of those torches, the pull of those hands, the hollow triumph of being escorted into captivity. They called it a wedding. You know it was a reenactment. Rome still tells the story as legend, the brave Sabine women who stopped a war by accepting their fate, the brides who cried because they were pure, not because they were powerless. It's a comforting myth. It makes conquest sound romantic. And so the first step into marriage was to be taken, not given. The Romans liked to think of marriage as sacred, So sacred, in fact, that they invited the gods into the bedroom. The newlyweds didn't spend their first night in privacy. They spent it in a shrine disguised as a bedchamber. The lectus genialis, the marriage bed, wasn't just furniture, it was an altar. The act of consummation was not merely physical, but religious. And like most Roman religion, it came with rules, witnesses, and a faint whiff of incense. You can imagine the scene. The chamber glows with candlelight, perfumed with frankincense and myrrh. The walls are painted with red and gold, scenes of Venus and Cupid tangled in eternal choreography. On a marble pedestal stands a small statue of Juno Pronuba, goddess of marriage, holding her torch, the symbol of unity and perhaps of expectation. Next to her is Venus, draped in silk, watching with that serene half-smile that artists love to give her. The smile of a woman who's seen it all and isn't particularly impressed. You stand in the middle of this carefully arranged sanctity, your flame-colored veil now removed, your hair braided in 6 strands, one for each virtue a Roman wife was supposed to embody. You can only remember 2, silence and obedience. The others apparently are learned on the job. The attendants flutter around you like nervous doves, whispering blessings under their breath. They sprinkle petals on the floor, light another stick of incense, and murmur prayers to Juno to bless the union. You can smell the smoke, sweet, cloying, like honey poured on fire. Someone covers the mirrors, not because of modesty. The Romans were hardly squeamish, but because the gods are watching, and mortal reflection is considered bad luck. It's better if you don't see yourself tonight. The gods will do the watching for you. There is no music now, just the slow rhythm of the fire and the soft rustle of silk. Outside, the city hums faintly. Inside, the silence feels heavy, too deliberate, like a silence that's been rehearsed. Every breath feels amplified. Every movement echoes against the marble. You are standing in the chamber of the silent God, and every statue has eyes. There's something unnerving about it, this blend of devotion and surveillance. The Romans, masters of control, even managed to regulate intimacy. Love was private, but marriage was public, and tonight was the ceremony's final act. In this moment, you realize that even the bed has rules. The sheets are white, not for romance, but for purity. The oil lamps must stay lit, to keep away evil spirits, of course. And before you so much as sit, the bride and groom are expected to offer a prayer together. You kneel beside your husband. His voice is steady. Yours trembles. He thanks the gods for unity, for peace, for a prosperous household. You thank them for strength, though you suspect it's a different kind of strength than he's thinking of. When the prayer ends, the attendants bow and leave. The door closes softly. For the first time all day, there are no witnesses, except, of course, the marble ones. Juno stares down from her pedestal, torch raised as if to inspect your virtue. Venus smiles faintly, amused by your hesitation. On the opposite wall, a fresco of a wedding feast shimmers in the lamplight. Dozens of painted guests watching a painted bride who looks eerily calm. You sit at the edge of the bed. The silk is cool under your fingers, smooth as water. The smell of incense still hangs thick in the air. For a moment, you think of home, the simpler bed, the smaller room, the absence of gold and marble. For a moment, you think of freedom. Your husband joins you. He looks proud, ceremonial, slightly uncomfortable. The Romans didn't have the modern language for romance. Love was a distraction. Duty was eternal. Tonight isn't about affection. It's about continuation, of lineage, of power, of Rome. He takes your hand gently. You notice his ring, gold, engraved with his family crest. It glints in the candlelight like a seal of ownership. He speaks softly. The words are kind, but the tone is rehearsed, gratitude mixed with possession. You nod, smiling as the priest taught you. The moment stretches. The air feels heavy with incense and expectation. The statues keep their silence. And in that silence, you realize the truth. This isn't your wedding night. It's a ritual reenactment, one that has been performed thousands of times before and will be performed thousands more. You are not the first woman to kneel in this chamber, and you won't be the last. The bed remembers. The walls remember. Even the gods, patient as ever, have grown bored of pretending this is about them. The candles flicker. A draft moves through the room. You glance toward the covered mirrors and wonder whether they'd show you the person you were before tonight, or the one you've just become. Because the Romans weren't wrong about one thing. Something sacred does happen in this room. It just isn't love. It's transformation. The girl who entered in silk leaves as property. The bride who trembled before the gods becomes an instrument of legacy. The ritual works, not as blessing, but as erasure. Even the smallest gestures are symbolic. The way you cross your hands, the way you look down when he speaks, the way you breathe when the torches hiss in the draft. All of it carefully choreographed to please both man and deity. You think back to the priest's words earlier in the ceremony. Let the wife be the hearth of the home, warm and unyielding. Unyielding. That part makes you smile. Rome adored contradictions. Women were expected to be strong enough to endure everything, yet soft enough to never resist it. Outside, the city grows quiet. The torches flicker lower. The smoke curls upward, forming ghostly shapes against the ceiling, the last offerings of the night. And for just a moment, you understand the cruel genius of it all. Rome built its beds like temples, where love had to perform as faith. This chamber isn't meant for comfort. It's meant for order. The statues remind you that you are being watched, not cherished. The gods don't care about your happiness. They care about your obedience. Every breath here is a prayer, not of devotion, but of endurance. You lie back, eyes tracing the carved patterns in the ceiling, the faint shadows of laurel leaves and vines. Somewhere in the distance, a bell tolls. You imagine it's for you, a small ceremony of mourning for the person you used to be. And in that silence, you realize that Roman religion didn't just sanctify life, it sanctified control. It wrapped every act in piety so no one could question the cruelty beneath it. Here, in the chamber of the silent God, love isn't private. It's ritual. It's performance. It's prayer recited without faith. And as you drift toward sleep, not peace, but resignation, you can almost hear Juno whisper, "Be still, my child. The gods are pleased." Her voice, if it ever existed, is calm, indifferent, ancient. It sounds exactly like Rome itself. And that's when you understand. The gods were never silent. They were simply waiting for you to stop speaking. Privacy is a modern luxury, something Romans never quite understood. For them, even the most intimate moments required supervision, commentary, and occasionally, applause. And if you were a Roman bride, particularly one with a powerful husband, your wedding night wasn't just a personal milestone. It was a public verification. You might imagine that after the day's chaos, the songs, the torches, the prayers, the newlyweds would finally be left alone. But no, not in Rome. The door might close, but the world stayed just on the other side of it. Servants, attendants, and family members would linger in the hallway, whispering, shuffling, listening. Some historians suggest they stayed to ensure everything went as expected. Others say they were there to protect against omens. In truth, they were there to record an event, the moment two powerful houses officially merged in flesh and law. They say some listened, others timed the silence. The Romans didn't trust anyone to handle their own affairs, especially women. So even consummation came with witnesses, at least indirectly. The sheets, the timing, the noises, or lack thereof, all could be noted, discussed, and reported. Not officially, of course. Rome loved discretion, as long as everyone knew exactly what was being hidden. Now imagine the scene. The chamber still smells faintly of incense from the earlier rituals. The fire has burned low. You're sitting on the edge of the bed, every sound amplified. The creak of wood, the flutter of the curtains, your own breath. Outside the door, sandals scrape against marble. Someone clears their throat. You can sense them. A line of silhouettes waiting like judges in a trial you never agreed to attend. You glance toward your husband, who doesn't seem to notice. He's accustomed to this kind of scrutiny, born into it perhaps. For him, this is not a night of love, but a performance of legitimacy. For you, it's a test you didn't volunteer for. Rome was obsessed with legitimacy, not just of heirs, but of morality. The purity of the wife reflected the virtue of the husband, and the husband's virtue, in turn, reflected the glory of the empire. It was a delicate chain of reputation that depended on what happened behind that door tonight, which meant, of course, it couldn't really be private. The senators who toasted your wedding earlier are probably still awake, discussing it over wine. The servants who carried your veil are whispering about it in the corridor. Even the gods, who claim to be silent, are peeking from their marble corners. Somewhere, in another house across the city, another bride is experiencing the same ritual. Another group of attendants waiting, counting, pretending not to listen. It's as though Rome collectively decided that intimacy was too important to be left to the people actually experiencing it. You breathe slowly, trying not to make a sound. The lamps flicker. The air feels heavy, scented with oil and expectation. The door remains closed, but the outside world presses against it like a tide. And this exact moment, is what Claudia Octavia would have known all too well. She was the daughter of an emperor and the wife of another, married to Nero when she was barely a teenager. Tacitus describes her wedding as a public act, a spectacle staged for Rome's elite. She was praised for her modesty, admired for her silence, and scrutinized for both. Her virginity wasn't just a matter of purity, it was a matter of politics. When Octavia entered Nero's household, her body became part of imperial diplomacy. The court gossiped about her like an artifact, examined, discussed, never left alone. Even her sorrow was dissected by historians centuries later, noted like evidence in a moral case study. Tacitus wrote that the Roman people pitied her. They saw how she endured Nero's cruelty, his affairs, his contempt, and admired her for suffering gracefully, which is an elegant way of saying they watched her die slowly and called it virtue. For queens like Octavia, even consummation was governance. The night she married Nero, she was expected to transform from princess to empress in one evening, under observation. The union had to be legitimate, the heir unquestionable, the dynasty secure. If she failed, the failure would not be private. It would be Rome's scandal, whispered in corridors, immortalized in scrolls. That was the curse of Roman nobility. Every breath you took was a political statement. Every silence was a strategy. Even your suffering could be weaponized, turned into propaganda for the empire's moral superiority. You can almost hear them now, the footsteps beyond the door, the murmurs of attendants pretending not to eavesdrop. The scrape of sandals as someone shifts weight from one foot to another, waiting for a signal that everything has gone properly. The Romans were nothing if not thorough. They didn't just want heirs, they wanted proof of the process. And yet, what no historian writes about is the quiet humiliation of it all, the sense of being watched, even in darkness, the feeling that your body isn't yours, not even in the moments that are supposed to be private. You start to notice the absurdity, how Rome could build aqueducts, conquer continents, and still refuse to leave newlyweds alone for 5 minutes. The gentle sarcasm of it all almost makes you laugh. Almost. Because if you laughed, they'd hear that too. They'd write about it, probably. The bride was cheerful, they'd say, and Rome's omens were favorable. It's safer to stay silent. The night drags on, the fire crackles. Somewhere outside, a servant coughs softly, a reminder that there's always someone listening. The whole empire is built on that principle. Nothing goes unheard. Even when the night finally ends, the scrutiny doesn't. The next morning, the attendants will clean the room, whispering to each other as they fold the sheets. Rumors will form like smoke, gentle, insidious, impossible to contain. Maybe they'll say the marriage was perfect. Maybe they'll say it wasn't. It doesn't matter. The truth in Rome was whatever the witnesses decided it was. And so the tradition continues, for Octavia, for every bride who came after her, for anyone foolish enough to think that marriage meant privacy. Rome believed privacy was dangerous. It left too much room for truth, because truth, unlike ritual, can't be controlled. And the empire thrived on control. So when the attendants step back into the corridor, and the door finally creaks open to the dawn, they'll nod politely, pretending they didn't hear a thing. And you'll smile politely, pretending they didn't either. But everyone knows the truth. In Rome, the walls had ears, and worse, they had opinions. There was a rumor in Rome, the kind that slipped quietly through palaces and servant corridors, whispered just loudly enough to be remembered. They said that on the morning after a wedding, someone, a servant, a priest, an ambitious relative, might glance at the sheets, just to check. Not officially, of course. Rome loved propriety. But propriety in Rome always had a loophole. The story went that a small stain, faint as wine diluted in water, could prove virtue. That blood meant purity, and the absence of it meant shame. Now, there's no solid record of this being Roman law. Historians will tell you it's a borrowed myth, an echo from older Mediterranean cultures, absorbed into Roman imagination. But that's the trouble with rumors. Once they start, they live longer than truth. And in a city where women were judged by what could not be seen, a rumor was often more powerful than evidence. So whether or not anyone ever checked the sheets, the idea that they might was enough to keep an entire empire's worth of women very, very quiet. You can imagine it. The bed still warm from the night before, the sunlight creeping through half-drawn curtains. Somewhere a servant enters the room to gather the linens. She hesitates. She glances down just for a heartbeat before folding the cloth. And that brief look, that fleeting, meaningless glance, might decide the rest of your life. Rome didn't need blood. It needed suspicion. A husband's doubt was evidence enough. A whisper, a rumor, a conveniently timed frown. That was all it took. You could spend years performing modesty. The right gestures, the right tone, the carefully practiced blush, and lose everything because one person decided you hadn't blushed quite enough. That's how the Romans worked. They didn't codify cruelty. They ritualized it. And purity in Rome was never just about innocence. It was about control. The ideal Roman woman was like a temple, untouched, devoted, sacred to the gods of family and reputation. And like a temple, she was meant to belong to everyone except herself. Agrippina the Younger knew this game better than anyone. She was born into it. As the daughter of Germanicus and the sister of Caligula, she learned early that a woman's virtue was a weapon, usually wielded by someone else. When her brother accused her of immorality, he didn't need proof. He only needed an audience. The Senate believed him, or pretended to, because in Rome, power decided what was true. Years later, Agrippina would use the same tactic herself, weaponizing chastity and scandal depending on what the moment required. She became a master of it, the art of surviving through suggestion. But even she couldn't outrun the myth she embodied. Nero, her own son, eventually turned that same whisper against her. The empire that demanded purity would not tolerate the woman clever enough to fake it. Julia Livilla faced the same fate. Accused of impurity, exiled, condemned, her name tarnished not by any proven sin, but by the imagination of men who found her inconvenient. That was Rome's favorite punishment for women. Accusation without evidence. You didn't have to be guilty, you only had to be discussed. And the language of those accusations always returned to the same imagery. The defiled bed, the stained sheet, the tainted home. It didn't matter that the gods themselves were hardly models of chastity. Jupiter couldn't keep his tunic tied for a single myth. Venus had more affairs than altars. But Rome didn't expect its men or its gods to be pure, only its women. Because purity wasn't a moral category, it was a political one. A pure wife meant a legitimate heir. A legitimate heir meant stable inheritance. And stable inheritance meant peace. The entire empire, in a sense, rested on the illusion that women could be perfect. So they built a society that required constant inspection, not written law, but cultural instinct. Fathers watched daughters, husbands watched wives, and the public watched everyone. Every gesture became data. Every silence a confession. If you were too shy, you were hiding something. If you were too confident, you were corrupted. If you were too quiet, you were guilty. If you were too loud, you were worse. The logic was flawless, as long as you never tried to live by it. And yet, for all their obsession with evidence, the Romans left nothing tangible behind. There are no court records of linen presented to judges, no temple archives listing sheets blessed for purity. There's just the rumor, a faint echo from ancient gossip. But it survived. It always does. Because the Romans didn't need rituals to make women afraid. They only needed stories. Stories told by mothers to daughters, quietly, like warnings. Be careful, they'd say. The servants notice things. Or, don't sleep too late, people will talk. Stories told by priests in sermons about the virtue of obedience. Stories repeated by poets who confused devotion with decorum. Stories that crawled through centuries until even modern scholars began to wonder if maybe, just maybe, it was true. That's how effective Rome was at propaganda. 2,000 years later, and we're still talking about a stain that probably never existed. But the symbolism endured. It became the perfect metaphor for Roman morality, invisible, unprovable, and somehow always your fault. So picture it. The chamber is quiet now. The torches burned out hours ago. The linen lies folded neatly at the foot of the bed. The sun climbs higher, spilling gold across the marble. You can hear footsteps in the hallway, servants preparing breakfast, the hum of the house coming back to life. And you're still wondering what they'll think when they see the sheets. It doesn't matter that no one said they'd look. It doesn't matter that they probably won't. The fear itself is the ritual. The anxiety is the altar. That's how Rome ruled, through the power of imagination. By turning purity into a rumor, they made it impossible to prove and impossible to escape. It was the perfect trap. You could spend a lifetime preserving your virtue, only for one rumor to undo it, one jealous whisper, one careless accusation, one servant who folded the linen too slowly. The empire ran on roads and laws, but it survived on stories. And in those stories, a woman's worth was measured not by her actions, but by what men imagined about her when she wasn't in the room. So when historians call these tales legends, remember that for the women who lived them, the distinction didn't matter. Legend or not, the fear was real. Because in Rome, you didn't need to bleed to be judged. You only needed to exist. And so a woman's worth could vanish between linen folds. If you're still listening, you've already done more than most ever will. Subscribe before this story slips back into the shadows that once swallowed her name. They say that every Roman wedding began and ended with fire. Not just metaphorically, though Rome did love its metaphors, but literally. Torches, candles, oil lamps, hearth flames. Fire everywhere, glowing like the empire's favorite obsession. The Romans didn't just believe fire symbolized purity. They believed it enforced it. The bride was the keeper of domestic flame, and so, on her wedding night, she was ritually surrounded by it. The tede nuptiales, the wedding torches, burned bright enough to make the air shimmer. Each one was dipped in pine resin and carried by attendants chanting blessings to Vesta, goddess of the hearth. You can almost see it, the orange light bouncing off marble, the faint crackle of burning resin, the sharp scent of oil and smoke. It's warm but suffocating, like standing too close to divinity. The air smells of wax and ceremony, of things burning that are not yet ash. You stand at the center of it all, your veil glowing red in the torchlight. Your hair, still perfumed with myrrh, is about to meet iron. Because in this strange mixture of love and ritual, the Romans took something soft, the bride's hair, and made it warlike. According to Plutarch, a Roman bride's hair was parted not with a comb, but with the head of a spear, a relic of conquest, held in reverence, said to have been used once in battle. It sounds poetic until you imagine it. The cold iron pressing against your scalp, the weight of history in the hands of the attendant parting your hair, the gesture meant to symbolize both purity and submission, the union of peace and war. They set her hair with iron and flame, reminders that marriage was both sacred and warlike. The spear represented the old days, when Roman men took wives the way they took territory. When the Sabine women were persuaded to become mothers of Rome, their tears turned into myth, their suffering into ceremony, and the fire, that was for cleansing. The smoke purged misfortune, the light guided the way. Together, the spear and the torch told you everything you needed to know about being a Roman bride. Your virtue would be defended like a fortress and tested like one too. You try not to flinch as the iron touches your hair. The attendant murmurs a prayer to Vesta, asking for purity, peace, and a long life, which, statistically speaking, is optimistic. The heat from the torches makes your cheeks glow. You smile faintly, because that's what's expected. This is the last moment you will belong to yourself. The ritual continues with precision. The spear divides your hair into 6 parts. The crines, they called it, representing fertility, balance, and obedience. Each braid is tied with wool, the symbol of domestic virtue. A good Roman wife was expected to spin wool, weave cloth, and bear heirs, all tasks requiring patience and silence, conveniently the same qualities men admired most. Your attendants hum softly as they work. Their fingers move with practiced grace, like sculptors shaping devotion from flesh. Outside, the crowd waits, torches in hand, ready to escort you to your husband's home. Fire follows you everywhere, in front of you, behind you, around you. It is both your halo and your cage. The Romans believed that fire protected women, but only if it stayed controlled. A stray spark, an unguarded flame, that was dangerous. It could consume the house, and by extension the family's honor. So they made sure to keep you both sacred and contained. The irony, of course, is that the same empire that worshipped controlled fire also loved to burn things it couldn't control. Books, cities, people, sometimes even its own queens. And that's what makes the ritual so haunting. You, standing there beneath a crown of flame, smiling for the gods that never smile back. The torches flicker, casting ghostly patterns on the walls, as though the air itself is watching. For centuries, brides reenacted this same moment, from the humblest homes to the marble palaces of emperors. Agrippina, Octavia, Livia, all of them must have stood as you do now, eyes lowered, hair parted, surrounded by firelight and expectation. The difference was only the size of the audience. Imagine Agrippina marrying Claudius, the torches burning brighter than ever. Rome called it a union of destiny. She called it strategy. But beneath the politics, the same ritual played out. The same spear, the same flames, the same pretense of purity for a woman who already knew how to wield power far more dangerous than fire. Rome adored its symbols. It built entire religions out of them. The spear was the man's role, protection through dominance. The torch was the woman's, devotion through service. Together they made an empire that could conquer the world, but never quite learn how to love without conquering. As the final braid is tied, the attendant steps back and nods. The ritual is complete. The crowd outside cheers. The torches sway in rhythm. You can feel the heat against your skin, almost like approval. For a brief moment, it's beautiful. The firelight catches the gold trim of your dress. The smoke coils upward like incense. The air hums with ancient poetry. Then the smell of resin reminds you. Beauty and sacrifice always share a scent. You take a breath. The air is thick, hot, alive. The torchbearers begin to move, signaling the procession. One of them, a young servant with soot on his cheeks, looks at you with pity. He's seen this before. He knows what comes next. The laughter, the mockery, the ritual that will make you wife, property, and symbol all at once. You glance down at the spearhead resting on the table. It gleams faintly in the firelight. Once a weapon, now a hairpin. Once an object of war, now a symbol of peace. Rome, in its brilliance, found a way to make both mean the same thing. They told you it was sacred. They told you it was blessed. But deep down, you know, The spear doesn't bless, it remembers. The crowd outside begins to chant, Talasio, Talasio, the same ancient cry echoing through centuries. The torches flare. You lift your head. The air feels thick with smoke and inevitability. And for one surreal moment, you understand the genius of Rome. They never needed chains. They had ritual. They didn't need to tell you what you were. They let the fire do it for them. Because purity, for Rome, always smelled a bit like burning. The torchlight fades, the smoke curls upward, and the spear's shadow stretches across the floor, long, elegant, and impossible to escape. You follow it out the door, step by step, into a city that calls this love. By dawn, the empire already demanded a son. The wedding torches had barely burned out. The incense still clung to the curtains, and already whispers were circling through marble corridors. Would she conceive quickly? Would she bear an heir? Because in Rome, marriage didn't end with the ceremony. It began with the womb. A bride might have survived the rituals, endured the mockery, and emerged pure. But her true test came with her first missed cycle. Love was optional. Fertility was mandatory. The Romans didn't just hope for children. They scheduled them. Philosophers wrote essays on the best seasons for conception. Physicians prescribed diets of figs, honey, and goat's milk. Priests offered sacrifices to Juno Lucina, goddess of childbirth, while augurs, those professional interpreters of divine will, claimed they could read a woman's fertility in the flight of birds or the shape of her shadow. You could almost admire the efficiency of it all. Rome had turned reproduction into state policy, and nowhere was that pressure heavier than on queens. You imagine yourself waking after the wedding night, exhausted, perfumed, and already under inspection. The servants bustle quietly. The attendants murmur polite congratulations. Someone sets a bowl of fruit beside your bed, symbolic of fertility. The symbolism never ends here. Every grape, every fig, every gesture means something you didn't agree to. Outside, the city is waking. Somewhere, your husband's advisors are already calculating timelines. If you conceive soon, they'll praise the gods. If you don't, they'll question your health. If months pass, they'll question your loyalty. Because in Rome, a barren wife was never unlucky. She was suspicious. And a queen? A queen was never just a woman. She was an incubator for dynastic peace. That's what made Messalina the perfect bride, at first. She was young, beautiful, and fertile. The wife of Emperor Claudius, she produced a son, Britannicus, almost immediately after their marriage. The empire celebrated. Temples rang with prayers of gratitude. Statues were erected in her honor. Messalina Augusta, the fruitful empress. Fruitful. That was the highest compliment a woman in Rome could receive. Not wise, not brave, not kind. Fruitful. For a brief moment, she was the ideal, the goddess Juno reborn in silk and gold. Every midwife in Rome invoked her name when blessing newborns. Every senator toasted her health. Claudius, awkward and scholarly as he was, adored her. But Rome is fickle. The same city that worships you at dawn will devour you by dusk. When rumors of Messalina's affairs began to spread, rumors, mind you, started by men who envied her influence, the word fruitful was replaced with corrupt. Her fertility, once divine, became evidence of excess. Her passion, once admired, became moral rot. Tacitus, with the calm venom of a historian pretending to be impartial, wrote that she burned with lust. Suetonius called her monstrous. They never mentioned that her real crime was surviving too long in a world that only tolerated women in their most useful form. Pregnant, obedient, and silent. Her downfall was inevitable. Rome had no room for women who remembered they were human after giving birth, because in truth, the praise of Messalina's fruitfulness had nothing to do with her as a person. It was about what she represented: continuity. The empire needed sons to secure its future, and queens were expected to produce them on schedule like divine machinery. If she succeeded, she was holy. If she failed, she was dangerous. You can imagine it. A court physician adjusting his tunic nervously as he delivers the news to the emperor. "Not yet, my lord." The tension in the room shifts, almost imperceptibly. Another priest is summoned. A sacrifice is made. A slave girl whispers that perhaps the empress offends the gods. The weight of an empire's anxiety rests entirely in your abdomen. And when, finally, the first pregnancy arrives, the pressure only intensifies. The augurs predict the child's destiny, reading omens in the flame of the hearth, the color of the mother's cheeks, the direction of her sighs. Every movement of your body is a prophecy. If it's a boy, the gods are praised. If it's a girl, the silence is polite but disappointed. Rome never did hide its preferences well. Messalina had passed the test. For a while, her motherhood gave her power, or at least the illusion of it. But as soon as her usefulness waned, so did her sanctity. The same senators who toasted her fertility now whispered about her impropriety. The same poets who called her divine now described her as depraved. That was the Roman pattern: praise, idolize, destroy. Even the goddesses weren't safe from it. Juno herself was worshipped for childbirth, but mocked for jealousy. Venus was adored for beauty, but blamed for temptation. The pantheon was full of women Rome couldn't stop simultaneously needing and condemning. You begin to see the trap. The empire built its power on women's bodies and then called it destiny. Each womb was a border post, each child a treaty, each queen a peace offering. And the cruelest part was that success didn't free you, it just delayed your downfall. A queen who gave birth to a son secured her husband's favor for a while. But once the heir grew, her influence faded. Her duty was complete. She had fulfilled the prophecy, and the empire no longer needed her. The marble statues remained, of course. The poets kept writing. But the woman herself disappeared into the background, her worth reduced to what she once carried. You sit there, staring out the window, the first rays of dawn catching the edge of the palace columns. The air is heavy with incense from last night's rituals. You can still hear faint music in the distance, the last remnants of the wedding feast. The attendants arrive, quiet, respectful, efficient. One brings a bowl of pomegranate seeds. Another offers warm milk mixed with honey and herbs to encourage strength. They smile as though your body were a temple offering, not a person. Someone murmurs, "May Juno bless your womb." You thank them. What else can you do? Gratitude is safer than honesty. Outside, the city hums awake. Merchants shouting, soldiers marching, senators being carried in litters. The empire is alive, impatient, demanding. And somewhere within it, your name is already being discussed. Not your ideas, not your laughter, just your capacity to reproduce. Because Rome didn't see its queens as women. It saw them as infrastructure. Messalina, for all her cunning and flaws, learned that lesson too late. The same body that made her an empress became the weapon that destroyed her. When the accusations came, adultery, conspiracy, treason, they all returned to the same theme. A woman who could not be controlled through her womb had to be punished through it. And the empire, ever theatrical, made sure the lesson was remembered. When you're a queen in Rome, your life is a ledger, measured not in years or victories, but in children and the purity of the story they represent. Even now you can feel it, the invisible audience waiting to see whether you'll succeed. The weight of centuries of expectation pressing down on you like a crown that doesn't quite fit. Somewhere, the augur is drawing symbols in the ashes, whispering prayers to gods who never answer. The physician is mixing herbs. The priest is burning offerings. Everyone is waiting. And you, the bride, sit quietly by the window, aware that every heartbeat has become public property. Queens were remembered not for love, but for wombs that worked on schedule. And Rome, as always, preferred the ones that did. You've met him twice. The first time, he was smiling, that charming, calculated smile of a man who knew the whole city was watching. The second time, he spoke only of peace, not affection, not family, just peace, the kind Rome could sign with your body. Now he stands before you again, not in the Senate, not in the Forum, but in your chamber, the man they call your husband, the general, the hero, the stranger. He's older than you remember, broader. His skin carries the dust of 100 battlefields, his eyes the kind of weariness that turns victories into burdens. This is Mark Antony, the man your brother, Emperor Octavian, has decided you will marry. Because Rome, for all its pomp and marble, still makes its treaties out of flesh. You are Octavia Minor, sister to the most powerful man in the world. And tonight, your body is the bridge between two warring empires. You don't speak, neither does he. The silence hums like tension before a storm. The torches along the wall flicker, casting long, unsteady shadows. Outside, the city is celebrating. Feasts, music, wine, declarations of unity. Inside, it feels like mourning. You sit at the edge of the bed, still in your veil, trying to remember how to breathe. Antony removes his armor piece by piece. The sound of metal against marble is slow, rhythmic, ritualistic. He doesn't look at you. His every movement says, "I have fought harder battles than this." You've met him twice, and both times he spoke of politics. Tonight, he will speak of peace again. Not with words, but with the performance Rome expects from its leaders. Because this marriage isn't about affection, it's about optics. Your brother, Octavian, arranged it carefully. The Senate approved it publicly. The people applauded it loudly. Every Roman woman was told it was a symbol of harmony, that through your union, civil war would end, families would reunite, and the gods themselves would finally rest. No one asked what you wanted. The truth is simple and cruel. Your husband doesn't love you. He respects your brother. He needs your dowry. He admires your virtue. In the detached way a collector admires a rare coin. And yet, you are expected to love him. You study him through the veil of torchlight, his heavy frame, the lines etched deep around his eyes, the faint scent of oil and iron. He doesn't seem cruel, just distant. The kind of man who confuses loyalty with possession. He clears his throat, says something polite, something practiced. You answer softly, the words you rehearsed with your attendants. You speak of duty, the gods, the future of Rome. Your voice sounds calm, detached, the tone of someone already used to living as a symbol. He nods. Silence again. You can feel the empire pressing in from all sides, the weight of expectation, the invisible crowd of witnesses. This isn't a wedding night, it's a performance. Two bodies pretending that love is a form of diplomacy. Outside, a torch flares in the courtyard. Somewhere, the priests are still chanting blessings to Juno, unaware that the only thing being sanctified tonight is political convenience. Antony finally sits beside you. His hands are calloused, his expression unreadable. You catch a glimpse of something human in his eyes. Maybe pity, maybe indifference. You'll never know which. He says, "Your brother believes this will bring peace." You nod. You both know it's a lie. Peace never lasts in Rome. It just changes its costume. The hours crawl by in ritual silence. When the candles burn low, you close your eyes, not from weariness, but from resignation. You understand now why Roman wives are praised for their quiet. It's easier to be admired when you don't interrupt history. Days turn into weeks. The marriage becomes official, complete with parades and banquets. Statues are carved of you and Antony standing side by side. A perfect image of unity. Rome loves images. They're easier to control than people. You play your part perfectly. You smile at the festivals. You stand beside him during speeches. You visit temples and offer prayers for fertility, for peace, for things you secretly stopped believing in. The people love you for it. They call you Octavia the Virtuous. You are the model Roman wife, loyal, composed, a vessel for stability. You bring Antony's children from his previous marriage into your household. You raise them as your own. You soothe his temper, forgive his absences, endure the whispers. Because in Rome, endurance is the highest form of praise. Then one day, the letters stop. The messengers arrive less frequently. You begin to hear rumors, soft at first, then impossible to ignore. He's in Egypt, with her, Cleopatra, the Serpent Queen, the woman whose name alone could unmake peace treaties and marriages alike. She is everything you are not, theatrical where you are composed, defiant where you are dutiful, alive in a way Rome never allowed you to be. At first you don't believe it. Then you do. Then you wish you hadn't. You hear that he calls her his wife, that he gives her land, crowns, children, a future. You hear that he laughs again, and Rome laughs too, not at him, but at you. The Senate whispers that Antony has been bewitched, that Cleopatra has poisoned him with her foreign spells and silken treachery. But the people don't pity him. They pity you. Octavia, the abandoned wife, the living emblem of Rome's humiliation. Your brother, ever the strategist, sees opportunity in your suffering. He parades your loyalty as propaganda, sends you publicly and gracefully to Egypt with troops and supplies for your wayward husband. You know what he's doing. You go anyway, because even when Rome uses you, it demands you act grateful. When Antony refuses to see you, the city back home applauds your composure. The poets write about your patience. Statues of you multiply. You become the ghost of Roman virtue, everywhere, admired, untouchable, irrelevant. You smile in marble, the eternal symbol of what Rome calls docility. The years pass. Wars are fought. Your brother wins. Antony and Cleopatra die. You survive, because you always do. You manage estates, raise children, attend ceremonies. You fade politely into history, leaving behind a trail of admiration so suffocating it almost counts as pity. You never remarry. You never speak ill of him. You never rebel, because Rome loves its symbols docile. And in the end, that's what you become, a living monument to restraint. They will carve your likeness in stone. They will write your name beside words like chastity and honor. And they will forget that you were ever a woman who once sat beside a stranger in a bed and tried to convince herself it was destiny. The stranger will become legend. The queen will become myth. And you will become Rome's favorite story. perfect wife who never asked for more. And so she became one. There are many ways to commit a crime in Rome. You can plot against the emperor. You can steal from the treasury. You can insult a senator, misread an omen, or fail to laugh at the right joke. But if you're a woman, the easiest crime of all is to say no. Rome called it patria potestas, the power of the father. But that authority didn't fade when a woman married. It merely changed hands. A Roman husband inherited the legal rights her father once held: ownership, control, punishment. The empire itself endorsed it. Marriage in Rome was not a partnership. It was a chain of command. A good wife obeyed, a bad wife resisted. And resistance, in the eyes of Rome, was rebellion. Few stories capture that truth as sharply as that of Claudia Octavia, the emperor's wife who refused to pretend that cruelty was love. She was the daughter of Claudius, the sister of Britannicus, and the unwilling bride of Nero. Her name alone should have made her untouchable. Instead, it made her a target. Tacitus tells us that she was quiet, reserved, and devoted to duty. Rome praised her modesty, until the moment it became inconvenient. Nero, on the other hand, was already halfway to madness before he'd grown his first beard. He wanted affection. She offered respect. He wanted adoration. She gave silence. And in Rome, silence could be interpreted as defiance. When she refused his advances, it wasn't scandalous. It was treasonous. The palace whispers began quietly. First, that she was cold. Then that she was barren. Then that she had insulted the gods by rejecting her husband's love. Within months, those whispers became law. They said she was barren, disobedient, ungrateful. Her crime was grief. Grief because she had watched her father die. Grief because her brother had been poisoned. Grief because she lived with a man who believed love was another form of conquest. And Rome doesn't like grief in its women. It makes them unpredictable. The courtiers said Nero had tried to be patient, that he had offered her gifts, music, games, that she was unresponsive. They left out the part where unresponsive meant terrified. When he took Poppaea Sabina as his mistress, the city gossiped approvingly. Poppaea was vibrant, ambitious, and beautiful. All the things Rome celebrated in theory and destroyed in practice. Nero called her his true wife, even while Octavia remained empress by law. It was inconvenient, of course, to have two wives, but Nero was never one to let laws or lives interfere with desire. He needed an excuse to get rid of Octavia, and the empire, loyal, pragmatic, and always eager to please, gave him one. They said she was infertile, that her body had offended the gods, that her womb was cursed, her virtue a fraud. And so the Senate voted. The priests nodded. The poets stayed silent. Octavia was exiled to the island of Pandataria, the same barren rock where Julia, the daughter of Augustus, had been sent for adultery a generation earlier. The same place Rome used to send women who refused to disappear quietly. The records say she wept when she left the city, that the people followed her carriage through the streets, shouting her name, begging Nero to spare her, that even the servants cried. But Rome's sympathy has always had a short lifespan. Days later, Nero announced that Octavia had been plotting treason, a convenient discovery. He ordered her death. They say she was executed in the bathhouse, strangled, then bled to death. Her head was sent to Poppaea as proof. Tacitus, ever restrained, calls it a deed of horror, which is Roman historian language for a murder too common to surprise anyone. It wasn't the first time a husband killed a wife for convenience. It wouldn't be the last. Roman law allowed it. As long as a man could claim moral reason, the courts looked the other way. Under patria potestas, a husband could punish his wife, disown her, exile her, even execute her, all in the name of family honor. Technically, he was preserving purity. Realistically, he was preserving control. The empire ran on that logic. Obedience kept order. Fear kept obedience. Even the gods followed this hierarchy. Jupiter punished Hera's jealousy. Mars demanded loyalty in battle and submission in love. The divine mirrored the domestic. A universe built on the idea that power must never be questioned. You can imagine Octavia on that final night, sitting in a cold marble room, the sea wind pressing against the windows, the echoes of the city still faint in her memory. The servants avoid her eyes. The guards wait at the door. Somewhere down the corridor, water drips steadily. The only sound left that isn't cruel. She isn't angry. She isn't pleading. She's tired. The kind of tired that doesn't come from sleeplessness, but from the realization that there's nowhere left to run. Rome had demanded obedience from her since the day she could walk. She had obeyed. And it still wasn't enough, because in Rome, the goalposts always move. A woman's virtue was never her own to define. It was whatever men needed it to be that week. Chaste when it suited them. Tempting when it didn't. Loyal when it was useful. Disposable when it wasn't. Octavia's death wasn't just the punishment of one woman. It was the maintenance of an entire system. A reminder to every wife, sister, and daughter of what happened when symbols tried to stop being symbolic, and the city understood. The lesson spread faster than her ashes. The senators went home to their own obedient wives. The poets wrote hymns to the emperor's new consort. The people whispered, mourned, and moved on. Because that's how Rome survived, by burying its guilt under marble and memory. Even centuries later, her story is told as tragedy, not outrage. She is praised for her innocence, her grace, her silence, the same traits that doomed her. No one ever calls her brave. No one ever admits that refusing Nero was the only act of freedom she ever had. The empire loved to say that order was divine, that submission kept the world spinning. It's easier to worship obedience when someone else is dying for it. Octavia's ghost lingers in history's quiet corners, a symbol of what happens when a woman's virtue stops serving the state. You can almost hear her in the echo of those marble halls, her voice low and steady. My only crime was sorrow. And perhaps in that final thought, she found a kind of victory. Because grief, for her, was the last thing Rome couldn't control. In Rome, obedience was a virtue, and silence, a survival skill. If you've listened this far, you've already done what Rome feared most. You've heard her. Subscribe, before the silence wins again. The Romans worshipped health the same way they worshipped everything else, loudly, expensively, and often with terrible results. A woman's body, they believed, was a sacred machine, built to serve the empire by producing heirs and punished by the gods when it failed to do so. And when that machine stopped working the way Rome expected, the physicians were summoned, not to heal her, but to restore her usefulness. The Romans called it cura, meaning both care and correction. The two were interchangeable. You can almost smell the room, hot wax, crushed herbs, and bronze instruments gleaming under the lamplight. The physician adjusts his toga and gestures toward the patient, you, a wife of status, draped in linen, face pale with exhaustion. It begins, as all things in Rome do, with ritual. The air thickens with incense, An attendant grinds poppy into paste. Another warms a jar of olive oil over the flame. The scent is both soothing and suffocating. Sweetness masking the metallic tang of fear. You lie still, because stillness is expected. The physician mutters prayers to Venus Genetrix, patroness of fertility, then begins his inspection. According to Pliny the Elder, the list of cures for infertility was long and imaginative, part medicine, part mythology, part blind guesswork. A woman might be told to drink wine mixed with hare's rennet, or to bathe in the blood of a sacrificed goat. She might swallow powdered emeralds, wear amulets of boar's tusk, or inhale the smoke of burnt lilies to warm the womb. Pliny swore by them all, as if faith alone could turn superstition into science. If those failed, Serenus of Ephesus, one of the few physicians who treated women as patients instead of puzzles, recommended something gentler, herbal infusions of pennyroyal, myrrh, or silphium, the now extinct plant once worth its weight in silver. But even his methods involved fumigation, aromatic smoke funneled beneath the sheets, meant to entice the womb back into its proper place. The Romans were convinced that the uterus could wander. Galen, ever confident in his own brilliance, described the womb as a creature prone to movement, migrating through the body in search of moisture. When a woman fainted, wept, or spoke out of turn, Galen called it hysterical suffocation, the uterus, apparently, rebelling. The cure? Perfume near the nose, foul odors near the lower body, to lure the wayward organ back where it belonged. So there you lie, surrounded by fumes of rosemary and smoke, waiting for your anatomy to repent. The physician whispers reassurances. This is the will of the gods, he says. Your womb will obey. You don't correct him. You've learned that in Rome, everything must obey, even your organs. For women of high status, these treatments were practically public performances. The emperor's wife might summon the court physician to the palace, where attendants and priestesses watched the procedure unfold like a ritual sacrifice. The patient's modesty was protected by thin veils, but her dignity was left at the door. And if she conceived afterward, Rome celebrated. If she didn't, she prayed harder. That was the fate of Faustina the Elder, wife of Emperor Antoninus Pius. She was a symbol of virtue, fertility, and imperial health, praised for her devotion, admired for her motherhood. Temples bore her name, coins carried her image. The people called her Mater Castrorum, Mother of the Camps, because she accompanied her husband on military campaigns, blessing soldiers as though every legion were another extension of her womb. But what history forgets is the quiet desperation behind that holiness. Faustina conceived many times, but her early pregnancies were fraught with complications. The court physicians prescribed every known remedy, smoke, herbs, oils, invocations, and she endured them all without complaint. She swallowed every cure the empire invented, for the empire's sake. Her pain was patriotic, her endurance divine. And when she recovered, the Senate built her a temple, not because she lived, but because she survived in service to them. Rome adored women like Faustina, obedient, enduring, endlessly fertile. They praised her as a model of piety, conveniently forgetting that her health was sacrificed on the altar of expectation. Even healing in Rome was a kind of obedience. Medicine wasn't about comfort, it was about control. A wife's treatment was never truly hers. Every prescription passed through the hands of her husband, her physician, her priest. Every cure was measured by its political value. A healthy wife meant a stable household. A pregnant wife meant a strong lineage. An infertile wife meant scandal. And so, when the doctors came, you didn't say no. You let them test their theories, the herbal baths, the fumigations, the bronze tools polished to a shine that reflected everything except mercy. They say the instruments were delicate. Small hooks, narrow tubes, rounded specula. But bronze is never gentle, no matter how carefully it's held. The air fills with the clatter of metal and the murmurs of prayer. You lie still, staring at the painted ceiling, tracing the patterns of laurel leaves, while the empire tries to fix you. The physician assures you it's nearly over. He says this as though the humiliation isn't part of the medicine. When it's done, the attendants bathe you in rose water and oil. They drape you in fresh linen, whispering that the gods are pleased. You nod. You even thank them. Gratitude, after all, is the only safe reaction to survival. Days later, you'll kneel before Juno Lucina's shrine, offering honey cakes and myrtle branches, praying for strength, not faith, not healing, just strength. Because in Rome, even prayer had an audience. If you're lucky, you recover. If you're very lucky, you conceive. If you don't, well, Rome has ways of forgetting the unlucky. The statues of Faustina still stand, her face serene, her hair coiled in perfect symmetry, the ideal Roman matron. The marble doesn't show the exhaustion, the bleeding, the days spent inhaling smoke until the world swam. It doesn't show the woman behind the goddess. It never does. Centuries later, her temple still rises above the forum, its pillars half-eaten by time. Tourists walk beneath it now, reading the inscriptions that call her divine. They never smell the herbs, or hear the whispers, or feel the sting of bronze. They just see stone, eternal, cold, obedient. You can almost imagine her ghost there, standing beside you, watching the crowd pass by. She looks tired, not tragic, just tired. The kind of fatigue that comes from doing everything right for too long. She smiles faintly as if to say, I was healed, but never free. And maybe that's the truest version of Rome's medicine. Not healing, but endurance dressed as virtue. Because in the end, even the cures demanded submission. Even survival required surrender. The gods received her offerings. Her body bore the cost. Rome liked to call marriage eternal. It just never specified whose eternity it was. For most Roman brides, the vows ended one of two ways: childbirth or a funeral. And sometimes the difference was measured in minutes. They told you that a wife's duty was sacred: to soothe, to serve, to stay silent. But in the palaces of emperors, sacred duty could be fatal. You can almost smell the room. Sweet perfume, jasmine and myrrh, clinging to marble walls. The gold-threaded curtains sway softly. Outside, the torches burn low. Inside, there's the sound of footsteps, slow, uneven, heavy with anger. This is Poppaea Sabina's chamber, empress, beauty, survivor, and soon to be a ghost. She was everything Rome adored. Clever, poised, dangerously perfect. Before Nero, she had already conquered half the city's elite. Senators whispered her name like a secret prayer. Poets compared her to Venus. She knew exactly how to make a room look at her, and more importantly, how to make it not look at her husband. For a while, it worked. Nero was enchanted. Poppaea replaced Octavia, the first wife he exiled and killed. The new empress sparkled with perfume and gold, worshipped by those who feared her. She bore Nero's child and became his divine partner, the visible proof that the gods had blessed his reign. But Rome's gods were fickle, and so was Nero. power, once fed, always grows hungrier. The same beauty that crowned Poppaea began to threaten him. Her influence, her opinions, her quiet defiance, they all began to feel like rebellion. And Nero had no patience for rebellion, especially in silk. Tacitus writes it simply, almost coldly. She was struck by Nero in a fit of anger and died of her injuries. That's how Rome writes its murders: brief, elegant, bloodless. One moment she was empress, the next an inconvenience. You can almost see it. The gold spilling from her fingers, the scent of her perfume still rising as the air goes still. No screaming, no grand declaration, just silence. The empire's favorite sound. Her attendants would rush in later, faces pale, hands trembling. They'd whisper prayers to Venus, not for Poppaea's soul, but for the emperor's temper, because in Rome, the death of a wife was not tragedy. It was an omen. And yet the city moved on. The Senate sent condolences. Priests offered sacrifices. Statues of Poppaea were quietly rededicated to the divine woman. Nero wept in public, performatively, beautifully, as though grief were another form of theater. He burned incense, built a shrine, even granted her divine honors. The same man who killed her made her a goddess. It was the neatest trick Rome ever played, turning guilt into religion. Her veil became her shroud. In that transformation, wife to corpse, corpse to deity, you can see the empire's entire philosophy. It didn't matter whether a woman lived or died, as long as she remained useful. Poppaea's death reinforced Nero's power. Her sanctity excused his cruelty. Rome always rewarded its abusers with marble. You imagine the scene later that night, the palace quiet, the air thick with incense, a few servants scrubbing faint red stains from the floor. The torches flicker, the perfume still lingers, and the city outside continues to celebrate a victory that no one remembers the cause of. That's how it always ended. The Roman wedding veil, the flammeum, was meant to symbolize devotion, flame-colored, bright, eternal. But too often it became a premonition. The same fire that lit the wedding procession lit the pyres at the end. Poppaea wasn't the first. She wouldn't be the last. Livia, the first empress, was rumored to have poisoned her rivals to survive. Julia, daughter of Augustus, was exiled for adultery and starved to death. Domitia, wife of Domitian, lived under constant threat. All of them learned the same lesson. In Rome, love was a negotiation. Affection, a liability. Every marriage in the imperial house was a performance for the crowd. Every smile was rehearsed. Every glance a message to the Senate. Every touch a reminder that politics could be whispered between pillows. And when love died, which it always did, the empire demanded an encore. Poppaea's story, tragic as it sounds, fit perfectly into Rome's rhythm. They loved their myths symmetrical. The beautiful woman who rose by charm must fall by cruelty. The empress who bore divine children must die like a mortal. The goddess made from blood was the empire's favorite kind of irony. Tacitus, ever cautious, blames Nero's rage. Suetonius blames a quarrel. Later historians, desperate to romanticize it, said perhaps it was an accident, that he pushed her too hard in a moment of jealousy. But history has always been kind to its tyrants. It likes to imagine their murders as misunderstandings. The truth, of course, is simpler. Rome taught its men that power was proof of virtue. If a man ruled the world, surely he ruled his wife. Violence wasn't seen as cruelty. It was order being restored. The same city that threw enemies to lions would hardly bat an eye at a wife's death behind closed doors. Poppaea's death was not exceptional. It was expected. that's what makes it haunting. She knew the danger. Every Roman woman did. From the moment of marriage, you were warned, obey, soothe, survive. But there's no training for love that rots into fear. No ritual to undo the sound of approaching footsteps when you've learned they mean pain. You imagine her final moments, the flicker of lamplight on gold, the faint rustle of silk, the perfume still clinging to her wrists, her hand on her stomach, her child still inside, her eyes fixed on the ceiling as everything fades into white noise. The poets will later call it tragic. The senators will call it unfortunate. The empire will call it necessary. Because in Rome, necessity excused everything. When Nero's grief began to bore him, he married again. Then again. He took mistresses, actors, even young boys dressed in Poppaea's image. The empire applauded each one. They said he was trying to heal. They said the gods forgave him. Rome always forgave its men. It had no vocabulary for forgiving women. You wonder what it must have felt like for the women who followed, those who were veiled in the same color, kissed by the same priests, led into chambers that still smelled faintly of Poppaea's perfume. They must have known. And yet, they smiled, because in Rome, smiles were safer than truth. It's strange, isn't it? The way the empire could turn horror into ceremony, could gild its cruelty in gold leaf, could tell stories so beautifully that no one noticed they were eulogies. Her name still echoes in marble corridors. Poppaea Augusta, the divine woman, the faithful wife, the mother of peace. She is everything the empire said she was, except alive. You look around that chamber one last time. The torches flicker lower. The perfume has faded. The air is still. Somewhere in the distance, the faint sound of a lyre plays from another room. Soft, mournful, almost kind. It's the same song Rome has played for centuries. A lullaby for obedience. A hymn for forgotten queens. And as the last note fades, you understand. In Rome, love was just politics performed in candlelight. And for women like her, the flame always went out too soon. The gods of Rome are gone, but their silence lingers. You can still feel it, in the ruins, in the marble dust, in the way history tells their stories without ever letting them speak. We know the names of Rome's queens. We know their faces, carved in cold perfection. We even know how they died, but their voices, lost, carefully, deliberately, beautifully erased. We know their deaths better than their dreams. That, perhaps, is Rome's cruelest success. It didn't just conquer nations. It conquered memory. Every woman you've heard about tonight, Octavia, Poppaea, Messalina, Agrippina, Faustina, exists only through the words of men who either feared or admired them, often both at once. Their histories were written not as lives, but as lessons. Tacitus, Suetonius, Cassius Dio, names carved into marble, celebrated by scholars, recited in lecture halls. But look closely, and you'll see the pattern. Their pens were swords, their sentences executions. When Tacitus described a woman, he wrote as though she were evidence in a trial. When Suetonius mentioned her, she became a scandal. When Dio recalled her, she was a cautionary tale, a footnote attached to someone else's glory. In their hands, women became either monsters or martyrs, nothing in between. Messalina was called depraved, though her only crime was living loudly in a world that wanted her silent. Agrippina was called ambitious, which in Rome was simply another word for alive. Octavia was sainted for obedience, then killed for it. Poppaea was worshipped for beauty, then punished for it. The men who wrote their stories didn't invent cruelty. They just edited it. Tacitus described Nero's brutality like a poet rehearsing restraint. He struck her in anger, and she died. 4 words, enough to fill an entire history with silence. Suetonius, eager for gossip, gave her more detail: perfume, vanity, deceit. Not the beating, not the blood, not the scream, just enough beauty to disguise the horror. Cassius Dio, centuries later, would write about the same women with detached amusement. She was ambitious, he says of Agrippina, and therefore dangerous. As though ambition were a plague to be cured by murder. The Roman historians didn't lie. They didn't have to. They simply chose what to remember. The empire had always been good at that. It built monuments for its victories and graves for its victims. Then it carved the same names into both. You can almost picture the libraries, rows of scrolls, all written in the same hand, the same tone, the same quiet satisfaction. Men telling stories about women who never got to tell theirs back. The irony is almost elegant, because these were not obscure women. They ruled empires, commanded armies of servants, shaped the politics of generations. Their faces were minted on coins, their words whispered through palaces, their choices reshaped dynasties. And yet, all that survives are fragments of how they were seen, not who they were. They were queens, mothers, scapegoats, never narrators. When Rome fell, the silence followed. It traveled through centuries, through medieval chroniclers, through Renaissance artists, through textbooks and classrooms, until even now, when we remember their stories, we're still hearing the echoes of those old, polished lies. We picture Messalina as corrupt, Agrippina as power-hungry, Poppaea as vain, Octavia as helpless. We rarely ask what they wanted. History loves its archetypes more than its people. And that's the trick, isn't it? To turn someone into a symbol, you first have to take away their voice. It's easier that way. A symbol can't argue. A symbol can't tell you that what you called ambition was survival, or that what you called sin was strategy. A symbol can't point out that you're only hearing one side of the story, the side that won. Tacitus claimed his histories were without anger or partiality, a sentence so perfect in its irony it could only have been written by a Roman, because Rome never needed anger or bias to erase you. It only needed silence. You can see it even in the ruins. The statues of the emperors stand tall, names, dates, victories. The women beside them, if they appear at all, are nameless figures holding fruit or torches or children. Their marble mouths are always closed. It's almost as if they're still listening. You can imagine one of them, Octavia, perhaps, standing before the gods who watched her die, looking up at their cracked faces and saying softly, "So this is eternity." And the gods, as always, say nothing. Rome taught its daughters that silence was virtue, and virtue was safety. Speak too loudly, and you became scandal. Resist too long, and you became history. And when you were finally gone, they called your endurance grace. You can hear the echo of it in the historians' prose, their polished admiration for obedience, their polite contempt for rebellion. Tacitus calling Octavia pure, Suetonius calling Poppaea beautiful, Dio calling Agrippina ambitious. 3 compliments, 3 death sentences. It makes you wonder what might have been written if the women had held the stylus instead. What would Poppaea have said about Nero's love? What would Messalina have said about desire mistaken for madness? What would Agrippina have confessed about power, not as temptation, but as survival? Would they have written histories at all? Or would they have written letters, diaries, prayers? Maybe they would have written nothing. Maybe they would have spoken instead, in laughter, in argument, in defiance, the kind of speech that doesn't survive on parchment, but lingers in the air. Because what was taken from them wasn't just their lives or their reputations. It was the right to define what happened to them. The right to say, "This is who I was." Rome never allowed that. It decided for them. And the world, obliging as ever, believed it. The silence of those women became the foundation of Western history, a grand story about civilization, written on the bones of those who were never allowed to speak. And yet, even silence leaves traces. A phrase here, a rumor there, a sentence in Pliny's letters, a coin stamped with a name that shouldn't have survived, a temple inscription half erased but still legible enough to whisper, "She was here." You can almost hear them if you listen hard enough. Not loudly, never loudly, but steady. The faint sound of a voice under marble, the echo of a breath in stone. Because silence, when it lasts this long, begins to sound a lot like memory. The gods of Rome are gone, but their silence lingers. And perhaps that's why we still tell these stories, not to resurrect them, but to remind ourselves what silence costs. Every empire leaves ruins. Rome's are beautiful because they were built by people who were never allowed to speak. You stand among them now. In the flicker of torchlight, in the echo of history, in the quiet that still feels too heavy to break. Somewhere, a statue watches you, its lips frozen, its story unfinished. You almost expect it to whisper, but of course, it doesn't. It never does. And so the torches begin to fade. We've walked through chambers and corridors where love was rewritten into law, where vows became treaties, and where tenderness wore the mask of duty. You've seen the rituals that promised eternity and delivered obedience. You've heard the laughter that hid cruelty, the prayers that sounded like orders, the silence that survived even the gods themselves. Rome called it civilization. History calls it tradition. But up close, it was just control, disguised as ceremony, wrapped in perfume, lit by candlelight. The brides of Rome were told their nights would be sacred. They were. Sacred to politics, sacred to lineage, sacred to everyone except them. Every veil hid a negotiation. Every kiss carried the weight of empire. And every silence was mistaken for peace. Now the halls are empty. The torches burn low. The marble floors that once echoed with chants and laughter are quiet again. You can almost hear the ashes whisper, not with anger, but with memory. If you've made it this far, you've done what history rarely does. You've listened. You've stayed through the smoke and the superstition, through the wedding songs that sounded like dirges, through the laughter that disguised fear. You've heard them, the queens, the wives, the women history recorded only when it needed an example. Subscribe, or let these stories vanish back into silence, because that's what happens to voices when no one listens. They fade into the ruins, and only the marble remembers. So close your eyes now. Let the torches die down. The fire has burned long enough for tonight. Sleep well, and may your night be quieter than theirs ever was. And before you drift away, know this. By watching, by listening, by caring enough to make it to the end, you've done something small but rare. You've helped keep their stories alive and supported the work that pulls them from the dust. You're part of the few who listen all the way through. You're the reason these ghosts still have voices. Thank you for being here. Now, let the last flame go out, and let history finally rest.